This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So in case you have any questions later on, feel free to let me know. As I said, the topic is Dataflow integration solution for Power BI, and that's what we are going to talk about today. If you have any questions, put that in the chat window. I'll get back to that like in between different sections, and we'll check what are questions. Okay. So agenda of what I'm going to talk about is first, what is Dataflow? Using Power BI, you might not ever heard of Dataflow. What is that? What are scenarios or use cases of using Dataflow? And what is the benefit of that, let's say, for you? Then a little bit explanation of how to create a data flow, what are different types of entities, what is linked entity, what is computed entity, a little bit about licensing and the folder structure of the data flow. We just have 1 hour, so we won't be able to cover that much deep of all different sections, and an architecture advice when you use data flow, how that can work out, right? So let's go through it and see how far we can go. In case I missed something, I have written articles about every sections, and you can follow those to get more information about data flow. Okay, the first part is what is a data flow? Data flow is the definition of data flow is a Power Query process that you run in cloud independent from a Power BI report, right? So parts of it is quite familiar already. Running Power Query in cloud is something that we already have. When you create a Power BI dataset, when you publish your Power BI dataset in the cloud, and when you schedule it, you are actually running Power Query in cloud, right? So what is unique about Dataflow? What is Dataflow is doing? The uniqueness of Dataflow is that it is not dependent on a Power BI report, because if you do a Power BI file, if you create a Power BI file, if you create a PBIX file and publish it to the cloud and schedule it to refresh, after refreshing your Power Query, the output will come into your Power BI report, because that is dependent on a report. Now, the uniqueness of Dataflow is that that is not connected to a report, right? It's independent from a report. When it runs the script, it will not load data into a report. So as a result, then you might think, okay, where is storing that data? Because that's the main thing, right? You run the Power Query script and you have to store it somewhere, right? Where it is stored. The storage of Dataflow as of today, right now, is Azure Data Lake storage. And this Azure Data Lake storage is a storage that you can store structured data like CSV files, Excel files, things like that, or unstructured data like image files or other stuff. The format that output of Dataflow will be stored here is a CSV format, which we will talk about that a little later, right? So it's a Power Query process, run in cloud. The output will be stored in Azure Data Lake, right? Now, when we come to talk about Azure Data Lake, the first thing comes into a lot of people's mind is that, okay, I don't have Azure Data Lake subscription, so as a result, I can't use Dataflow. That's not the case, because you don't have to pay anything extra to use the data lake part of the Dataflow. To use Dataflow, you can use just your normal Power BI Pro account. That Power BI Pro account, as part of that 10 GB space that it gives you in the Power BI Cloud space, it also gives you some space for the Dataflow storage, internal storage of Azure Data Lake inside Dataflow. You can use that. In case you have your own subscription of Azure Data Lake, you can connect that too. That's possible, but you don't have to, right? So you can just use your normal Power BI Pro account and use Dataflow with that, right? So after doing that process, after running Power Query in cloud, storing the output in Azure Data Lake, what happens then? Then in Power BI, you have the option to start get data from that data flow. So you can say get data and choose Power BI data flows as the as the source, and that means then you get the output of that Power Query, which was stored in CSV file in Azure Data Lake storage of Dataflow in Power BI as a normal data source, right? So that's the definition of Dataflow, right? Now, once you know the definition, what is, let's say, the benefits of using Dataflow? Because that's the definition. You have to know, okay, where you can use it, right? So let's talk about the benefits of that. Imagine when you have a shared table, a table that you use in multiple Power BI files. That happens quite often. Like, for example, you might have a product table used in inventory, used in sales. Date table is one of those tables that you use in a lot of places, right? If you have a scenario like that, right now, what is the solution? So right now you will create it in one of these Power BI files with Power Query, a lot of transformations, steps, you create that. But then if you want to create a copy, what you do is you go to advanced editor, most probably copy the script, go to the new file and create a new blank query, paste that over there, and that gives you a copy. What if you need a third model? Same thing. You go create a new copy over there. After a couple of weeks, if you realize that, okay, I need to make a change, you have to go and change it in one of those and then copy again in 2-3 others, right? It's not a model that you can maintain very well, right? If you have a shared query, separate Power BI files are not really good with working with a shared query. However, what you can do is use Dataflow to run that shared query, to store that output into a CSV file in Azure Data Lake, which is the automatic output of Power BI Dataflow. And then in multiple PBIX files, you can use that as a source. So one query table source of multiple places. In case you want to change the query, you go to that Dataflow, you change that, and all of these would be sourced from there. Just as simple as that, right? It makes your code much more consistent. It will reduce the redundancy of your code, and maintenance of that would be much more easier, right? Rather than just maintaining it in multiple places. This is one usage of that. What are other usages? For example, you might have tables which are running on different schedule. For example, you want your fact transaction table to be refreshed every 4 hours, but your sales table, sales table every 4 hours, but your date dimension table every day, just to update what is today's date and some other stuff, right? So that's every day. And a product mapping table, which is updating every week. Right now, if you have all of these three in one Power BI file, when you set a refresh, you set a refresh at the file level. You cannot refresh one query at a time, right? But if you put these queries in separate data flows, then you can schedule them to run on a different schedule as well, right? I'm just giving you ideas. Using Dataflow, you can build like a centralized data warehouse structure. You can have multiple data flows running and putting their output in Azure Data Lake. And then that output can be used like a data warehouse that can be used in Power BI. Right now, Dataflow output can be only used in Power BI, but later on, I imagine it would be available for other tools as well. There are some suggestions about bringing that into Excel, bringing that into other tools as well. So we should see that coming into other services of Microsoft. Using data flows, you can have a faster refresh time. That is another interesting factor about that. Most of the time, your Power BI data refresh takes a lot of time because you are doing data transformation in Power BI using Power Query. And when you do data transformation, that data transformation step takes long. It might take, let's say, half an hour for some transformations, or even, let's say, 5 minutes. But when you split that into 2 steps, when you do that data transformation in Dataflow, and then Power BI get data only from the output of that data flow, then Power BI actually is not doing that much heavy lifting work anymore. That part is passed to the Dataflow. So the refresh of Power BI itself would be much faster. The refresh of Dataflow still would take that much time, but then you can schedule these to be done separately, right? So you can put your heavy lifting transformations into Power BI Dataflow to get a faster refresh time in your Power BI dataset, right? There are a lot of other benefits in using Dataflow. I just give you some examples. Okay, now that you know what is Dataflow and you know what are use cases of Dataflow, let's talk about creating Dataflow. How do you create a Dataflow? There is a couple of things you need to know before creating Dataflow, and that is first, Dataflow cannot be created in Power BI Desktop. Similar to dashboard, that you cannot create dashboard in Power BI Desktop. Power BI Desktop only allows you to create reports. Dataflow is also a service-only feature. You cannot do that in desktop. You have to build it in the service, in the website. Another thing is that you can build it in the service in organizational workspaces, not in my workspace. My workspace doesn't allow you to build a Dataflow. And the third thing is that admin of Power BI in your organization can actually turn off the usage of Dataflow. They can turn it off or they can turn it on, right? So if you are in organizational workspace, but you still don't have the option to create Dataflow, that means the admin already turned it off, probably, right? Okay, so let's have a look of how to create a Dataflow. I have my my Power BI service window over here. Let me open it. Right. So this is Power BI service. I logged in with my normal Power BI Pro account, and I have access to different workspaces. As you see, if I go to my workspace, inside my workspace, I see a number of reports, workbook, data sets, but oops, sorry, wrong button. Let me enable my zooming so I can show it to you in a zoomed way. But as you can see, there is no data flow here, right? Dashboard work with data sets, no data flow. But if I go to another workspace, one of my organizational workspaces, let's say this workspace, then I also see data flow. So first thing is that you should be not in my workspace, right? So here I already have some data flows. Some of them are scheduled, some of them are not, some of them refreshed, some of them not. I'm going to create one to show you how it is working, right? So click on create. Data flow is one of the options here. So I can create a data flow like that. When you create a data flow, there are different ways of creating it. One is like starting from scratch, starting with new entities, or link it to existing data flows entities, or connecting to common data folder. Let's not talk about those for now. For now, I'm talking about how to create new entity. Okay, right. So I'll click on add new entity. Entity basically is a table. Everything in Power Query that you know as a table is like an entity. It's just a new name definition here in Dataflow. When I click on creating new entity, I'll see this this window showing something like Power Query online. If you have worked with Power Query, this is quite familiar for you. Having data sources, selecting those data sources, and going to the next steps, right? Now, not all data sources that we have in Power Query in Power BI Desktop are available here. Over there, we have about 80 data sources. Here we have less, but still most of the common data sources are available anyway, right? Like, for example, I can get data from SQL Server, from Exchange Online, which is giving me access to my emails. I can connect to OData. I can connect to Active Directory, SharePoint, text or CSV files, Excel files. As you see, a lot of these are already available. Now,
Reza, can I add something here, just for the audience? Yes. For people not to have the wrong impression, you can actually connect to every source that you can connect to from the desktop version, just that you don't have the icon here. But if there is a connection that you want to use from the desktop version and it's not visible here as an icon, you can begin writing the script in the desktop version and just paste it here in the data flow. So despite the fact that not all connections are visualized, you actually have the same engine running in the background, which means that you can connect to all the sources you can connect to from the desktop version. This is just something that is not obvious at first sight and can lead people to think that they have fewer options here, which is not the case.
Yep, that's correct. Thank you for the point. And a little bit later today, I'll show you, in this session, I'll show you that you can use blank query and copy whatever, Power Query script you have here, and that would run just like a normal Power Query script. The only type of connection that you might not have here is if you are using a custom connector, and that is also coming in the future. For now, it's not supported this way. It's a little bit different to add your own custom connector to that, but everything else, pretty much you can access it through blank query. Okay, so continuing on this, when you use Power Query in Power BI Desktop, the process is simple. You select the data source and then you connect to it, right? In here, it's kind of the same, but one extra step is also required, and that is gateway configuration. A lot of time, your data source is on-premises data sources, is not a cloud data source like Excel file locally or SQL Server file, SQL Server database in on-premises domain. In those cases, you have to have a gateway setup, right? Otherwise, if you go and choose a SQL Server database, when you enter server and database settings, if it is local and if you don't have a gateway, then it comes up with a message that, okay, you need a gateway, right? That is one of the differences here that makes creating data flow at the beginning a little bit different from creating it in Power BI Desktop, but process, is kind of the same, right? Okay, I'm going to show you an example of connecting to multiple data sources. The first one I'm going to show you is an OData data source. OData data source is like an online open data source. I just open it in web browser to show you how it looks like. This is a sample of that data, right? Now I use it in Power BI using OData. Okay. For OData, I don't really need to choose a gateway, but I can also choose a gateway. So the process is fine either if you use a gateway or not if you use a gateway. I'll just set it as none. For some reason, it doesn't like my gateway configuration. I can go to another example if this doesn't work. Okay, this OData source I recently found in one of my sessions that doesn't really like the way that this connection works. Okay, I connect to another data set. So let's say I connect to a text CSV file. This would be a better example. So this is a text CSV file located in a cloud data source, and if I click on next, I'll connect to that cloud data source and I see the data of that CSV file. So it's a CSV file, it's in cloud data source, it's publicly available. That's why it doesn't ask me for the credential, right? And when I click on that, then I get Power Query, let's say data transformations options here. As you see, some data transformations options are up there, and now I can apply transformations. For example, one of the things that I can do is I can go to transform tables and use first row as headers. So that brings my first row as headers. If I want to do any other transformations, I have some transformations options here. But this is not all you can do. You can do more than these transformations. It's just a matter of graphical UI that doesn't have these options. If you know how to write the scripts, you can bring those scripts here. If you right click on a query, you actually see the advanced editor, and you can write your own scripts, whatever you want, right? So it's not just these few items that you have at the top. There is a section for applying some AI insights as well. That is a premium function. You can't do that much with Pro account under Dataflow. You need to have a premium function to get it, right? So after setting up my Dataflow, my queries, I can call it something, whatever I want. Let's say service calls data or something like that, and you can have more than one query. This is just one I added. You can have multiple queries here, get data from other places, combine them together, and then finally save it, right? Very similar to Power Query again in Power BI Desktop. After doing this and saving your data flow, I call it Bulgaria User Group Dataflow sample, right? I save it, and then I can refresh it either manually like this or set a schedule refresh similar to Power BI dataset, right? I'll just go and hit the refresh manually here. And while this is refreshing, I also open a Power BI report just to show you that now I can use that as a data source in a Power BI report, in even more than a Power BI report. It isn't just one report you can use it. You can use it in multiple places. So that is still refreshing. And this is my Power BI data, Power BI desktop. In the get data, one of the options is Power BI Dataflows, or if it is not in this list, you can go to more, and then here under Power BI, you'll see Power BI Dataflows, right? So I'll connect. You see in the background that data set, that Dataflow is refreshed. So when I connect to Dataflows, first you need to connect it to your account. So I've already logged in. It seems working anyway. If you are not logged in, it will ask you for logging in. Right, now I see all of my workspaces here. And in these workspaces, I can choose which one I want. The one that I created was under this one here. And this is the data flow that I created. One data flow can have multiple tables, multiple entities. So this is the entity that I have created and refreshed, and I can select that as a data source. You see the data is already prepared. I haven't done that much transformation on this data flow. It was just on this entity, it was just like bringing those first row as headers. But if it was quite a bit of data transformations, for me here, it's just a matter of loading that data. That first step is stored it in Azure Data Lake. This second step is getting that from Azure Data Lake and loading it into Power BI. That's how the process from beginning to the end works of creating a data flow and using it, right? Okay. Next part is different types of entities in Dataflow. Before we go on to that part, any questions so far? You can put your questions in the chat window if you have any. I don't see still any questions. I see 25 people in the session, so I think still we have one perspective.
I have a
Okay, a
question.
question that there are some resources like ATS Scale 1, when we can see them here. I never used ATS Scale as a data source, but if it is a preview, usually preview data sources come a little bit later because it is preview and it is not yet available to use in the entire, let's say, Power BI ecology, so you need to wait for that preview to be fully available first, and then you would be able to use it in Dataflow as well. Does it support S3? Again, I don't understand what the S3 is. As long as it is a data source that you can use in Power BI Desktop, hopefully yes. Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services is actually including a lot of things. So Amazon Web Services can be a VM, right? A VM, for example, cannot be just a data source for you. In the VM, you can have different services and things like that. So same story. If it is, okay, Amazon Data Services, Azure Data Lake Storage. You mean getting data from Amazon Web Services, which is similar to Azure Data Lake Storage?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Do we have that already in Power Query in Power BI Desktop? Because if we don't, then it's not available here as well. Same story. If we have that data source available in Power Query in Power BI Desktop, we can connect it. Otherwise, no. Okay, so let's continue on the presentation. So that was the Dataflow demo. Now, in Dataflow environment, we have slight differences. I forgot to show you this part. I wanted to show you also a demo of if you have already a data transformation, how to copy that across. Let's say, for example, you have a transformation already, like you build your date table. Now you want to move that into Dataflow, how you can do that. So I have a Power BI file with a date table in it. Not a really complicated one, a simple date table with just a few steps. And I want to move that into Dataflow because that is something I use in multiple files. And I want to be able to share it across different files, right? So this is my Power BI desktop file, and here in edit queries, if I go, I'll find my date query. Yep, that's my date query with a number of steps, as you can see. Then I go to advanced editor. I'll copy this script. I'll go to Dataflow. Dataflow. Let's say I create a new one. Again, you can put it in an existing Dataflow or you can create a new one. One Dataflow can have multiple queries. I'll just do it in a new Dataflow. Okay, in this new Dataflow, this time I just use a blank query as a source. And this shows me the M script, the Power Query M script. I'll paste that script here. This is the script that I copied from Power Query in Power BI Desktop. In case this is sourced from local, here you have the option to choose the gateway. In this case, this is not. This is generated based on some values. So I'll click on next, and that builds my data flow just like that. You see all of the steps is available here as well, right? I can call it a date table. Save and close, refresh it, and then I can use it across multiple Power BI datasets. So if you already have a set of Power Query tables that you want to share between tables, that is a very good starting point to use Dataflow. You can use those, copy and paste it, and then build your first Dataflow using those. Right. So let's go back to our slides. There are some differences between Dataflow and Power Query and Power BI Desktop. However, one of the differences is that in Dataflow, there are different types of entities. In Power BI Desktop, all entities, or let's say all queries, are the same. In Power BI Desktop, if you reference a query from another query, that's just like a reference, right? It's still like a normal query. In Dataflow, however, if you reference a query from another query and your original query is still enabled to load, this type of new query generated is called computed entity. A computed entity is only generated when the source query is still loading, right? So you may have created a source query, but that source query might not be enabled load. In that case, it doesn't create a computed entity. It only creates it when the source is loading, right? What is the process? If you do that, it actually good for performance as well, because if you do that, it will load the first query's output in Azure Data Lake first. Then the second step is getting data from that output of the first one and storing it as a new Azure Data Lake entity. So it's like step by step. You are doing one step for first query, loading it into Azure Data Lake storage. The second one is getting it from Azure Data Lake storage, storing it in another query. That's why it's good for performance, because you are doing your data transformations in multiple steps rather than just doing everything from scratch again, right? This is called computed entity. However, the limitation is that computed entity is only available for premium usage of Power BI. With a normal Power BI Pro account, we don't have the computed entity. Another type of entity which is different is linked entity. Linked entity is an entity that you created in another data flow, but in this data flow, you just add it, you just bring it here to become parts of your model in this side, right? You don't do any transformations on this. You just use it as a table linked over there. It doesn't have any storage because this is a linked table. Of course, the main storage of this is under the other data flow. It's only read-only, right? This is called linked entity. It's different from computed entity. In computed entity, you can apply some changes. Linked entity is only like a link to that original entity. Again, linked entity is also a premium only feature. So linked entity and computed entity are premium only feature. I have written a blog post article about, in case you have Power BI Pro, how you can build your model in a way that avoids creating a computed entity. It needs a little bit of extra work and it's not always, let's say, ideal. However, if you don't have premium, that's an option to use, right? Then you can follow along and see what are the main ways of doing it. The main trick is that to avoid creation of computed entity, you should make sure that your source query is not enabled load, or instead of doing reference, do duplicates and things like that. It will create like duplication in your code, but still an option. Okay, so these are premium requirements on that. So let's talk about next topic. Next topic is common data model. The concept of common data model needs a little bit of introduction first, then I'll talk about what is the usage of that in Dataflow area. Imagine scenarios like this. We have a lot of data sources, a lot of databases, and a lot of applications, right? Every application might have its own database. When it wants to connect to another database for another system, it needs an integration to that database or that system. If a database wants to connect to another application, that needs an integration. This will create a mesh like this, that every data source connects to every application separately. Integrating such a solution would be a quite painful process, because if you add a new system, a new data source, lots of new integration should be done, and it's a very time-consuming process. It's like silos of data, silos of applications. What is an ideal method for that is to create something like this, a shared data model. A shared data model is a data model somewhere sitting in between applications and databases. All databases understand shared data model. All applications are also understanding shared data model. If they want to read something from a data model, they connect to shared data model, which is a defined template place with the data in it. if databases want to interact with each other, they use that as well, right? Now, this shared data model is what we call common data model in Power BI world. It's actually a concept that came first from Dynamics 365. It has been used for some years already in Dynamics 365. So what is common data model? Common data model is a set of template tables. They don't have any data by default, they just templates. And there are templates of more than 250 entities, or let's say tables. An entity for account, an entity for, let's say, product, for all different types of things that you might think of. There's an entity, that entity have tables and fields and different, let's say, entities has different set of fields. You can even add your own entity. Now, what is the usage of that in the Power BI world? In the Power BI world, you can actually set output of your data flow to store data into a common data model. The way that it works is that when you have a entity in Power BI data flow, let's say, for example, this entity, right? Then you can click on map to standards. That is the option you have in a data flow, map to standard, and that is when you connect it to a CDM or common data sources. And these are all different types of entities available, accounts, a lot of different types of data sources are available here, right? So you choose whatever you want. In this case, my table is date, so it doesn't really make sense to connect it to something. But if it was a table that could connect to, let's say, contact, then I selected the contact, I mapped the fields. It automatically tried to map it based on the field names, but if it can't, then I can map it and I can use it in Power BI. Not only in Power BI, that's the main thing about common data model. Not only in Power BI, I can use that CDM or common data model also in Power Apps, in Flow, in other technologies that use CDM. And here is a glance of what are technologies that are using CDM. So Dynamics 365 use that. Power BI use that through Dataflows. In Office 365, we have it in Azure Data Services, in Azure IoT Services, and later on in SAP and Adobe, they are also going to use the Common Data Services concept. So it's like a central hub for connecting or integrating applications with each other. That's how the Common Data Services plays in the middle of all of these, right? You can have a Power BI solution, Power BI data flow solution without common data folders, common data services. It would still work fine as long as you are in Power BI world. You might not need common data services or common data model. You need it only when you are interacting with other applications, right? Okay, so I'll get back to this part quite quickly, but before going to that, let me check if there's any questions. No more questions on this side. Okay, thank you for mentioning the blog. Yep, if you are interested to learn more about data flow, Matthew Roche has a really good series of blog posts. I highly recommend reading that. I have a link to Matthew Roche blog at the end of my slide deck as well, right? Okay. So we have just about something about 10 minutes, so let's go through the rest of this and we'll see if there's any questions at the end. So what are the benefits of data CDM? As you have seen, the benefit of that was decoupling applications from data sources. Like you can have things called industry accelerator are used quite often for this. With common data model in between, you can have the application layer and the data source layer to be decoupled from each other. Like, for example, if I have an application like this, a Power BI application like this, that is related to higher education, it gets higher education data and analyze it. Now, if I connect this to CDM, when I give it to another business, another company to use it in their organizations, all they need to do is to connect it to their CDM, right? So that's how the integration part works. It's highly integrated solution because you have worked on a CDM structure, which is quite standard. Okay. Common data model, or let's say Dataflow itself, has a folder structure, which I'm going to talk about that quite high level, not that much deep. Folder structure for Dataflow or common data model is like this. So we have CDM folders. Inside each CDM folder, we have a JSON file, a metadata file, and under that folder, we also have a folder for each entity, and data files of each entity is there. To see what this JSON file look like in an existing data flow, you can actually go to an existing data flow. I'll cancel this one and closing that one. I can go to an existing data flow, even the one that I created just right now. When I click on these three dots, there is an export.json, right? That will give me the JSON file, which includes all metadata information. I have a slide showing what that JSON file looks like. This is an example of that JSON file. That JSON file has some description about what is this data flow, what is the name of that, what are the queries under this data flow. You see I have a number of entities. The MS script for every one of those is also there. There are a lot of information, the relationship between entities, and things like that. You get all of these information through that JSON file. It's quite a powerful metadata explanation file. It has all of these reference models, relationships, annotations, the Power Query data mashup, MS scripts, and things like that. This link that I put in the slides is a good source for or another way to understand it. For me, it was just to export a number of JSON file and see how they are structured. That's another way to understand how this looks like, right? So that's the structure of that, which shows you how it works. And as I said, the folder structure is that you have workspaces, under workspaces data flows, and under data flows then you have the JSON files and each entity. The data at the moment is stored as CSV. Later on in the future we might have other types of data storage supported, but this is at the moment what is supported right now. Data flows can be also created or sorry, not created at the moment. Data flows can be at the moment interacted using the REST API. There are functions that give you the ability to get a data flow or delete a data flow, refresh a data flow. These are all options for developers in case they want to interact with data flow through REST API. The licensing of Dataflow, you can use Dataflow with Power BI Pro. It's not mandatory to have premium, but if you get premium, you get some extra things in it. Like for example, with Power BI Premium, you get computed entity, you get linked entity. You can run it under a premium capacity, which is a dedicated capacity. You get parallel executions of some transforms and things like that. The main difference between these two is that. And finally, the last part I want to mention is the architecture advice that can help to build your data flow. I've written an article about this recently. You can use data flow to have a centralized ETL process, centralized data transformation process. You do your data transformation, you load the output into Azure Data Lake, and then you can have one or multiple Power BI shared data sets that acts like the model layer. So this is like your data transformation layer. This is the modeling layer, and you can have multiple Power BI reports using get data from Power BI dataset to connect to it. So this way you have visualization layer, modeling layer, and the data preparation layer, three different layers of building a Power BI solution, not just doing everything in one Power BI file. This is a better way of implementing it, especially if you have multiple developers working in one environment. Okay, that was pretty much everything I wanted to say today. So that's a summary of things I covered. And I've also written a Power BI book on architecture. If you are interested, you can get it from this link over here. All of the examples I mentioned to you, there is a link to an article that I written about that. I written more than 7-8 articles on Dataflows. You can go and check them out. Matthew Roche also has a really wonderful series of blog posts about Dataflow. I highly recommend reading that. And Microsoft documentation on Dataflow is also quite good. So make sure check that out. Okay, now back to questions. So we have a question here. How are data flows and CDM supposed to be used in a proper data warehouse when the underlying database model is already defined? Are they meant to be used when there is no data warehouse or proper ETL? Most of the time I say the later is the case. If you already have a data warehouse defined, so going back to this architecture diagram that I showed you, if you already have a data warehouse defined and if you already have your ETL process, then you have this first layer already, right? Using Dataflow, build this part for you. If you don't have that, then you get the Dataflow to build that process. If you do already have it, I just say continue on the existing data integration solution that you have, on the existing ETL and data warehouse that you have. Dataflow is just for building that in a structured way in Power BI world, because a lot of people who use Power BI didn't have that backbone structure.
I would add also that you may still have a role for data flows, even if there is a proper data warehouse and proper ETL, and it's related to data security and to performance, because your data warehouse could be very, very large, which could have some performance effect if we're speaking about really large volumes of data. So data flows can still reduce the data to a certain extent. You can select certain items from the warehouse, or you can make certain aggregations so that you can hide sensitive information. Let's say in certain countries, I believe Germany, you are not allowed to indicate specific names under specific circumstances. So if you're doing some reporting on individual performance, then perhaps pulling the data as it is from the warehouse would not be really good, and you can do some transformations and aggregations in the data flow so that all the users building reports upon them do not have access to the individual names of the people. So this would be compliance related use of data flows that just comes to my mind right now.
Correct. And in the real world, I also seen scenarios that there is already a data warehouse, but still when people get data from that in Power BI, they still apply some data transformation. So there is a data warehouse, but in fact, that is not a data warehouse. It's used just as a data source, right? In those cases, again, you need to do data flow to build up whatever is needed. Any other questions? Okay, it seems there is no more questions. Thank you for attending. I'll send these slides to Michael so he can share it with others as well, and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you everyone for participating. And while Michael is not here, I would like to thank him as well for connecting us with you, Mirza. And the fact that there are no questions, I find it very good. It means that everything was clear, and for me it was very clear as well, although I haven't used data flows a lot and just read the theory for the most part. So everything was very, very clear, and we're very grateful. I believe I can speak on behalf of everyone for having you as a presenter in our group. It was really a great honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.